So fantastic. Hori-san, excellent welcome to the fourth Senate. I'm very, very honored, Jane, to see you live from the center of the world, right? Washington?
Yes. Said, I'm in the chaos capital of the world.
The chaos capital of the world. Well, it's wonderful. We're going to talk about US-Japan relations, not so much about AI. We leave that to the smart people in the room, right? It's very interesting, right? When President Trump visited Japan a couple of weeks after Takaichi Sanae became the first female prime minister in Japan, he landed at Yokosuka, got into the chopper, he flew into Tokyo, and as they caught eye line of the Tokyo Tower, the pilot turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, there's Tokyo Tower." And boom! Tokyo Tower goes dark. After a couple of seconds, lights back up again in the American flag. Then Mr. Trump arrives in Tokyo, gets into this car, the Beast, right, which can take about 2 corners in Tokyo, and drove up to His Imperial Highness, the Imperial Palace. And as he opened the door, or as the door was opened for him, and he gets out, in his eyesight are 3 Ford F-150 pickup trucks, which Takaichi Sanae had strategically placed there so that the president would feel at home. The point I'm trying to make is that the current prime minister's first job was a companion in Kobe to pay for her university. So that woman knows more on how to deal with vainglory men than you and I ever care to know about. So it's a very strong hold that you actually have. She's incredibly charming. She's very strategic. The theme, unfortunately, is this fractured world that there is everywhere. But when you look at the US-Japan relationship, just look at the data. Japan has about 1.1 trillion yen of overseas investments. About 2/3 is portfolio money, 1/3 is direct investments. Now, of that 1.1, how much is in the United States? 550 trillion. The next one is Europe, right, which is about 300. China is barely 30 trillion yen. So it's very, very clear that in economic terms, the nexus is a very close one. And since President Trump got elected, there is actually new flows of foreign direct investment into the United States of America that are running at double the usual pace. And this is outside the $550 billion commitment that Japan made to the United States, under the tariff agreements coming through. So the nexus in economic terms, the nexus between Japan and the United States is actually getting more dense, more broad, and more intense if you look at the capital flow data. Now, with this sort of overview, let me start out. Perhaps, Glenn, if it's okay, if we didn't rehearse for this. We're doing this true G1 jazz band style. But Glenn, maybe a couple of points. You've been a long history, at the helm of some of the U.S.-Japan relations, particularly on the trade side. Sort of for 3 minutes, your overview of the current state of U.S.-Japan relations.
Well, thank you very much. I split my time between Washington, D.C. and Japan, but since last September, I've been a visiting fellow at Stanford University because I'm focusing on the relationship between Japan and Silicon Valley for a book that I'm writing. So I'm very pleased to be here because I think this conference covers both the US-Japan political, military, economic, technological issues, and also the AI and the Silicon Valley issues. So to answer your question, I think it would be correct to say that the US-Japan relationship now is very strong. Part of it is that there's a very strong security and, frankly, ideological compatibility between the current administration in Washington and in Tokyo. So in addition to the Prime Minister's charm and ability to deal with men, I think that the Prime Minister also has Japan's secret weapon, Mr. Takao, who is the interpreter, who has interpreted for every meeting that Prime Minister Abe had with Donald Trump, every meeting that Ishiba had with Trump. He is the person in Japan who knows Mr. Trump the best. So he really understands, and Trump likes him and calls him Little Prime Minister, Mr. Little Prime Minister. And so I think that combination is a very powerful combination. But beyond the personalities, I think that the structural environment, especially the security relationship between the United States and Asia, and in particular with China, there is a great deal of shared interest between the United States and Japan on the security side, the political side, the economy, the technology. So the environment right now is very good. So I don't know, the golden age, I think we'll see how that develops. And you can, define what you want to emphasize with regard to what aspects of the U.S.-Japan relationship is you can consider the golden age. But overall, I'm quite optimistic. Now, the two caveats I have on this, of the three major parties that I look at closely, the United States, Japan, and China, Japan is the most stable. I think in many ways it's the most predictable. Even if there's a change at the top, the structures are relatively stable. The U.S. is not predictable, as Jane Harman said. The president thrives on chaos and confusion, and so it's very unpredictable what's going to happen. And China is actually right now probably more predictable than the U.S., but less predictable than Japan. And so this upcoming meeting between President Trump and President Xi in May is going to be a very important meeting, both from the standpoint of the U.S.-China relationship, but also the triangle of the U.S., Japan, and China. So I'm going to be watching that very closely. But overall, I would go back to saying that the U.S.-Japan relationship right now is at a very strong and very positive stage. And the technology part we can talk about later, but that's another element that I think is a kind of a glue that will further cement the relationship between the two.
Right, fantastic. So we've got the economic alignment, we've got the ideological alignment, personality alignments, thanks to a great interpreter and a charming prime minister who knows how to play men. Jane, the center of chaos, you called it. Give us your insight. You've been a proud interlocutor between Japan and the United States for a long time. We all think you are Hori-san's secret girlfriend in Washington. But your point of view on the state of the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Well, I think I'm Hori-san's great-grandmother, but nonetheless, he is a charmer. You talk about charming people, enormously successful, and I'm very sorry not to be appearing in person. I love this conference. And I hear a deep echo for what I'm saying. Can people hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, okay. All right. So I was thinking, as the last speaker spoke, that making war on the Pope is not a great strategy. And that is what is in the news here last few days. And one person even questioning, I think it was Sean Hannity, whether the Pope had read the Bible. So I just point out that this is not improving the image of my country. On the Japan relationship, I think it's going well. I like many, was mortified when the president mentioned Pearl Harbor in front of your prime minister as some indication that maybe the Japanese relationship had been or is in trouble. I don't think it's in trouble. And I think especially on the defense side, as Glenn just said, it's very strong. I was last in Japan about a year ago. I took a walk around the Imperial Gardens with Yoshi, and we were talking about how the U.S. command has been restructured so that it's much stronger. Had come from Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, where I was with my Defense Commission that reported shortly thereafter. And as far as best I can tell, that restructuring is very positive for both sides. And Japan is spending a record on defense, and Japan is extremely well positioned on a matter that we haven't mentioned yet, but that should be a topic of discussion between our president and Xi Jinping in a few weeks, and that is Taiwan. Japan gets it, where Taiwan is and what threat or opportunity it poses to the region. And Japan is prepared to be very helpful to protect Taiwan. And so I would just say my bottom line is, in spite of some of the circus that's going on where I live, the structure and the support for our relationship is good and should not be in doubt.
Right. Fantastic, Jane. Thank you. We'll come back, and maybe you can tell us a little bit where the chaos in Washington is going to go to, because we all want to know. Bob, your insights, from, sort of a business consultant's perspective on the U.S.-Japan relationship, and any sort of perhaps anecdotes that you would like to share.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, and as a leader of a global consulting firm and I also travel extensively, really all across the world, I see the Japan-U.S. Alliance in probably some different terms, more through a corporate lens and certainly from a global perspective, global development as well. I think the chaos is not only at the political level. I think some of that chaos extends to the business environment as well, quite extensively. I think you have certainly U.S. business leaders that, feel that a lot, either before even this administration, probably feel it by focusing on short-term markets, being subject to vulture investors and other sorts of dynamics there already, and then to add to it what can only be described as tremendous uncertainty brought about by this administration and this state of the world with geopolitics where it is. And it's not just the U.S. policies, but it's certainly all the instability across the world. But I would say it's in that context where many leaders, I think not just U.S. leaders, but many leaders in corporate contexts and corporate settings also see Japan as really a model of predictability, of consistency, long-term policies. I think, Glenn, you talked about it too, ones that transcend an administration, transcend the government in many ways, right? That is what I think so many corporate leaders around the world also look for. And I think right now that is that's a model that Japan is bringing. And I can say that not only from a U.S. perspective, but I see that in other parts of the world too. I've spent a lot of time myself. I still have a home in the Middle East. The Middle East looks to Japan as well in a very, I'd say, very productive ways, kind of thinking about how they can further develop bilateral relationships, but also in the context of how the world is changing. So it's interesting to bring that corporate perspective to what Jane and Glenn have just shared.
Right. I want to pivot a little bit. Glenn, when we last met in Tokyo, we talked a little bit about, this administration, whatever you think about the clowns running the circus, about the actors, it's very transactional. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's very simple what Mr. Trump wants, right? And despite the rhetoric, there is a transactional element to it, which is in sharp contrast to some of the democratic relationships. So when there's a democratic president, Glenn, you've been through different cycles. You've been part of the democratic administration, but tell us this insight into Republicans versus Democrats and U.S.-Japan relationship.
Well, this is a very interesting point that I've been watching for the last 40 or so years. And I think it is true that, put it this way, when there's a change of administrations in Washington, when the Republicans take over, where do the Democrats go? The Democrats who used to be in the government, they used to go back to universities, law firms, think tanks, NGOs, NPOs. They don't go back to business because not many of them came from business. On the other hand, when the Democratic administration takes over, where do the Republicans go? They just go back to business because that's where they were from. And then when they go back to business, they do business with Japan.
Right.
So there's a very strong corporate connection. And when these American former Republican senior officials go to Japan, they often will not only do business with Japanese companies and with Keidanren and Keizai Doyukai and so forth, but they usually drop by to see the LDP. They usually drop by to see the Minister of Foreign Affairs and METI, sometimes Minister of Finance. So there's a very close, I would say, alliance between Republicans and the LDP. Part of it is just historical, ideological from the 1950s and the Cold War. But so there's an ideological element, a historical element, and also a very strong business element. Now, if you compare especially the Biden and Trump administrations, there are some similarities, but one of the major differences is that, and I think Jane will correct me if I'm wrong, but because Joe Biden was elected at the age of 29 to be a senator, and he was in Washington for 36 years as senator and 8 years as vice president, he had no outside of Washington experience, right? So he had few friends in the business sector. He hired almost no one at the senior level in the government with business background, business experience. Now, Gina Raimondo at Commerce had some venture capital experience, but she was basically a politician, and she was the governor of Rhode Island. So in contrast to the Obama or Clinton administrations, although they were Democratic administrations, they actually had a lot of people from business. So that's a real contrast, I think, between the Biden administration, which had almost nobody. They're all Washington people. They're all people who work on Biden's staff, right? And then Trump, on the other hand, has all these people who are outside of Washington, most of them in business. And one of the things is that in the first Trump administration, he did have some people around him, like John Bolton and McMaster and John Kelly and people who had, and Mattis and others who had Washington experience. But this time, he basically brought in people who will listen to what he wants to do. And so there's no real check on him, either by his staff or by the member of the cabinet, or frankly by the Republican Senate or the House. And so there's that difference. Also, I think that because Biden was in Washington for such a long time, it was a very bureaucratic organization. And each person, undersecretary, assistant secretary, had a role. And so in that sense, it was easier for Japan to deal with that, because Japan is a very bureaucratic government, right? Trump, on the other hand, is like a guy running a company. It's like a chusho kigyo. It's like a one-man company. And he's never had a boss other than his father. He's never had a board of directors. He's never had a 360-degree personal evaluation, right? And so he kind of does what he wants, right? And Biden, on the other hand, delegated everything, right? So it's a very, very different style as well as orientation. I can go on forever on this, but those are some of the highlights.
No, but it's interesting, right? Because again, it's very dangerous to talk about Mr. Trump because people have strong opinions and he's so offensive to many in so many different ways. But there is this transactionalism. There is, like you said, very, very well put. He's the oyabun, right, of a chusho kigyo, right, and makes 1,000 decisions a day, right, which is what you and I do in business, right? But in Washington, on a normal day, right, if you get 2 decisions done, that's a lot. Right? One of them, of course, is I want my double screen latte with a skinny milk, oat milk, this, that, or the other, right? Always very important to get your coffee choice right. But in all seriousness, Jane, from your perspective, sort of this Washington ossification, the swamp, the bureaucratization, the institutionalization, the over-focus on process rather than getting things done, which is obviously, one of the core ideologies that Mr. Trump wants to destroy. What is it creates chaos, right, this transition, but is this sort of the creative destruction that is going to end up making America more efficient and more effective?
No. Definitely no. Not that I think creative destruction is bad. Let me correct something you said. forget about the latte. He orders from McDonald's, and he gets bags full of this stuff delivered, and it's amazing.
But he eats it with golden knife and fork.
Probably, yeah. Well, certainly with golden wallpaper and golden light fixtures. But I think it's much more complicated. For example, personal story. My late husband, Sidney Harmon, was the founder of Harmon Kardon, and it had a major facility in Japan, headed by the late Art Suzuki, who some of you may know, and I thought was great. And he knew a lot about business, and he sold his company to become the deputy secretary to the cabinet, the Carter administration, and brought a lot of business acumen, of course I would say that, to Washington as a Democrat. And so I don't think the history is Republicans get business, Democrats get bureaucracy. But I think more recently, what has messed this all up is a combination of social media plus partisanship. And I have watched my former employer, the United States Congress, become basically a joke. My new acronym is CACO. You know, you've heard Trump being called taco. Trump always chickens out. Well, CACO means Congress always chickens out. And it doesn't do anything. And instead of working together, which was a history, certainly when I was there in the early years of my 9 term, working together to solve hard problems for which you got rewarded. Now you blame the other side for not solving problems. And for anyone who was listening, I hope you weren't, to the debate on the floor of the House this morning about whether the war powers resolution should be invoked with respect to Iran, all that was about was, I'm patriotic and you're not. No, I'm patriotic and you're not. Well, how is that useful? And so I would say, sadly, that we have increased partisanship. And I would say also about Trump, that he has brought a transactional approach to everything. And we don't have a foreign policy with a strategy, which we have had under prior Republican presidents. Think Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush. So I worry that, for example, Taiwan is a real estate deal to President Trump. I'll trade you the geography in exchange for the chip firms, and it's not that easy.
Right. Bob, from your perspective, this chaos, the focus on transactionalism, right? Sort of you watch global business leaders make strategic decisions on where to allocate productive assets. You know, over the last year, you know, with the Trump administration coming in, you know, what are the sort of 2 or 3 key changes that you've observed from the key decision makers of corporate leaders?
Yeah, I think first I would comment on the climate in Washington and perhaps the business influence. I think you're right. There's a lot more kind of business leaders there, but I would also argue it's quite narrow. Most are Wall Street and hedge fund types, you know, rather than broader corporate interests, or are very aligned with, you know, lower regulation, you know, and, you know, certainly deal making and transaction oriented type approaches. So, you know, that does not represent the global community. What is interesting, though, I'd say there's a few things where, you know, I've done a lot around industrial policy and new eras of industrial policy, new ideas around industrial policy. And it's not tariffs. I think it's far more than just tariffs. It's really about, you know, making investments in strategic sectors and developing over time. You know, I used to argue that even in the Biden administration, you know, the CHIPS Act, you know, was looking at global security, the importance of semiconductors, and beginning to bring back some level of manufacturing to the United States. Those policies were continued by Trump. So, you know, there's behind it some themes that are emerging, which I think are very important for, you know, certainly for the U.S. economy and thinking about security, you know, through industrial competencies, right? So that's, I think, you know, encouraging even behind all the chaos is that there, at least there's some longer term commitment to that. How that gets done is where, again, the chaos sets in. You know, this constant back and forth, lack of predictability, you know, it's not clear for business leaders where it's headed next, and that does create issues. But I think, you know, this is where I'd say it's, you know, the bilateral relationship does have another side. And you know, when I think, you know, the Japanese government is navigating as well its relationship, you have also a lot of Japanese organizations that are starting to look to invest behind really a great track record over the last many decades that you talked about at the beginning. They have inroads, I think, in this current climate to actually make productive investments that I think the U.S. would receive with a lot of enthusiasm.
Right. I want to pivot a little bit. If you step back, what has changed, right? So I've been stuck in Japan since before you were born, since 1985. And you're in finance, basically you remember every 2 or 3 years, Japan becomes the flavor of the months. And, you know, the hedge funds, the pension funds, they all come. So, you know, of course, over the last couple of years with the Nikkei, with the stock markets, with asset markets performing well, there's been this influx of foreign investors coming through. What has changed? What has changed is you now have what I call men in black. So these are gentlemen, mostly, very few women, who represent the defense establishment or defense venture capital things. Clearly, in all this chaos, as an investor, one of the mega trends, whether we like this as a human being or not, is defense spending. Everybody is increasing defense budgets. Japan has opened a honeypot, right, by committing to a structural increase in defense spending, by now openly talking about dual-use technology, by easing up the export constraints that Japan did have here. Wanted to get your insights on sort of this nexus of the US-Japan relationship that you actually have, where the defense establishment and the security relationship was always the big anchor, right? Not just the unsinkable aircraft carrier of America in Asia, right? A very deep and dense relationship. But that's now changing, right, with venture capital, right, coming into this as well, plus the Japanese domestic development coming through. In my discussions with the Prime Minister's office, yes, their number one focus on the increase in defense spending is, how do I make Komatsu a better company? How do I make sure that your startup, if it does do dual-use technology, actually benefits from them? Just buying Patriot missiles from the United States is not going to make Japan better. And so this dynamics on the defense spending, I'd like a quick comment on.
Well, it's a very important point, and actually that's one of the themes I'm exploring in my book, which is that there are a number of factors. I think the first factor is the geopolitical background of China, North Korea, and now Russia and Ukraine. And so the environment for Japan, they're in a tough neighborhood, number one. In addition, I think since 2017 in Japan, there's an increasing questioning of the extent to which the US will be as reliable a partner as they had been hoping. And so that's another element. And then there is, as you say, in the post-war period, certainly the political leaders of the two countries and the military have increasingly worked together, as Suzanne Basalo well knows. There's been increasing coordination, interoperability, and equipment sharing, and so there's a lot of that going on. The missing element has been the economic and business side. And on that, I think it's quite true, as you say, that because of the changing environment, because of the defense spending expenditures rising, there's going to be a great deal of activity in dual-use technology and in the military. And I think, you know, some people in Japan are looking at South Korea as an example of a country that actually does have increasing domestic military manufacturing, but also exporting arms. Now, this is still somewhat controversial in Japan, especially among, I think, the older generation. But just within the last few days, Prime Minister Takaichi has said she's going to revise the Constitution. So that's another element in all of this. The revising the Constitution, easing the restrictions on exports of armaments, also the desire by the Japanese the companies, not only the heavies, like Mitsubishi and Kawasaki and the traditional, but also the NECs of the world, for instance, have already announced that they are heavily going to get into defense-related technology. So that I think the business element of that certainly is growing, and it's not only the heavies and the big companies, but also, as you say, the smaller companies, the venture capital companies, the companies that are small in scale but very advanced in technology. And so, again, I think in that sense, Silicon Valley will be an increasingly important place for Japan and the US to cooperate.
Yeah.
Jane, your insights on that, and with a particular focus, perhaps, I mean, you know, the revolution, sorry, I'm not a Washington insider, but the revolution that's going on inside the Pentagon, where you now have the second in command, the guy actually doing stuff, being a vicious venture capitalist who wants to change the entire procurement process while increasing the budget. The American defense budget is going to increase from 1 to 1.5 trillion. Do you know how much $1.5 trillion is? It's a little bit more than Elon Musk wealth, right? Which is difficult these days. It's 1/3 of Japan's economy. If this budget passes, 1/3 of America, 1/3 of Japan is going to be what America spends just on defense. But, you know, on the whole defense dynamics, the procurement dynamics, and America really doubling down on actually becoming even more superior in its military.
Well, a little history. I was elected to Congress in the first post-Cold War class.
Ooh.
And after the Cold, I know that was 4 centuries ago. Yoshi wasn't born yet. When the Cold War ended, the mantra in the U.S. was, "We won, everybody else lost. Everybody wants to be like us." And so we downsized the defense procurement budget, we downsized the intelligence procurement budget, and Jane came to Congress, representing the Aerospace Center of California, which is around Los Angeles, around LAX. The triple PhDs who won the Cold War were out in the cold. And then the issue was, what are we going to do with the employment base in this district? And 2 things happened. One was working with the then Republican governor of California, former senator named Pete Wilson, who's a wonderful guy. We came up with this strategy of dual use. And these aerospace firms that had just built tanks and so forth, there were no drones yet, were now building buses for commercial satellites. And I thought that was very healthy. And I think it is very healthy. Segue to Japan, and I do want to comment on our bloated defense budget, but segue to Japan.
Go ahead. Jane? It's the North Koreans.
And I think diversifying the defense industry around the world in the what I would call the Western world, or at least the non-China part of the world, is good. What I would not be in favor of is, uncontrolled development of nuclear weapons. And I know you're talking about nuclear capacity, but our treaties have expired, basically. China's not in them. And I hope in the post-Trump world, as soon as we can possibly get to it, we try to reinvigorate our non-proliferation treaties. And we also try to put guardrails around artificial intelligence. I know we're not talking about that today, but AI as a defense tool is potent, and you can't leave it unconstrained. But so what I would say about the U.S. now is the administration is wrong to rename our Department of Defense the Department of War. I'm for defense, not war. And it's illegal without Congress approving it to call it the Department of War or the Secretary of War. And so I don't call him that. I think a 50% increase in our defense budget, not our war budget, is inappropriate given all the economic stress that Americans are facing. And given the fact that we actually know, and I chaired this Commission on National Defense Strategy, what changes we have to make. We have to wean ourselves from legacy programs that fight the last war to software-based programs and much less expensive programs like drones that will protect us against future wars and make our country safer.
Thank you, Jane. I think the point that you raised about, yes, dual use, the rest of the world, Japan in particular, sort of catching up to dual use, and that can be a very, very positive multiplier for societies and for economies, and then highlighting the fact that nuclear procurement treaties have expired, and that's something that really, one ought to be taking up with some degree of seriousness, adding in the AI factor. Bob, from your perspective, this sort of dual-use business alignments, where do you see it in the Japan context, in the global context?
So first I have to divulge, I am an aerospace engineer by training, and I've worked a good part of my career in and around defense and security. Right. In the US, in Europe, and in the Middle East. So, this I think is really interesting to track. I think it also is connected to the rest of the agenda today, as we get into AI and modern technologies as well. I think first it's important to say that, without safety and security, economic development and growth is hard to come by, right? The need for long-term investments do depend on having greater safety and security. So while it may not be good for humanity what's happening, I think it also reflects the realities of the world today. And I think regions, countries taking more control of their own destiny in that regard, I think, agreeing with Jane, I think ultimately is necessary today. Maybe not good, I wouldn't say it's great, but it's necessary today. I think we also have to look at lessons from Europe, right? I mean, I think it's shocking to back away from NATO and the commitments of NATO. On the other hand, I also believe that Europe was probably a bit lazy in investing in their own defense. I use the word, try to be provocative here, I guess in good G1 style, Hori-san. I think they were lazy in investing in really tracking and counting on the US to provide almost unilaterally for their defense. But I think coming back to the technology point now, because I think that's again where it goes, it has become so sophisticated, and when you look beyond just kinetic warfare and kinetic threats, cybersecurity, AI, just to look at how a modern missile defense system works, the amount of communication that goes on in order to do that effectively across multiple platforms is enormous, right? So that's where, again, taking some control over that, I think it's a good thing ultimately for Japan to be investing in this way, but then doing it, together with other friendly partners like the US, to build systems that are more resilient and more capable, I would say, in a global context. So I do see some positives coming out of that, and I think certainly that's now a big shift with Japan investing in its own defense that way. I think fundamentally that's a good thing.
I want to tell an anecdote. 1 week after, Jane, what was that thing called? Liberation Day. Yes, 1 week after Liberation Day, very senior people from the leading cybersecurity, cyber defense company in the United States of America came to Japan, and they visited the police departments, the Defense Department, the Ministry of Finance. I was in one of these meetings. And they basically, in their usual charming American fashion, basically were saying, if you buy our system, we will make the tariffs go away. And to their credit, the Japanese said, the door is right here. Don't come back. It's very interesting, right? This point about, there's no question that Japan is very much behind in terms of cybersecurity, right? This is empirical. But buying the best and leading gold standard is not something that Japan wants to pursue, precisely because the level of mistrust, right, between America and the United States may be very large. Now, we leave that for discussions. I want to pivot to the final block, the People's Republic of China, right? If you're just looking at Japan, there's a huge codependence. In the world of money, about 31% of profits from Japanese listed companies are generated from dealing with the United States of America. 31%. Okay? About 20% of profits are generated by dealing with the People's Republic of China. As all of you know, there's a huge nexus between Japan and the People's Republic of China. 1/3 of the graduate students at Todai, at Tokyo University, are Chinese, right? Now, it's a little bit unfair. As you know, Japanese don't go to graduate school unless they become academics, right? But nevertheless, talk a little bit about the Japan-China relationship in the context of Japan. And perhaps, Jane, if I may jump, and ladies first on this one. Japan, China, China, US, what are your views?
That we all have to figure out how to get along, and that demonizing one country, especially China, is by itself a losing strategy. And I think it was Henry Kissinger, whom I was privileged to know for many years. Not that I agreed with everything he said, but I agreed with some of it, much of it, that we have to confront, compete, and cooperate with China. All of it, all at once, three-dimensional chess. And we keep forgetting, especially our transactional president is confronting China today, and then he is cooperating with China tomorrow. And no, it all needs to be of one piece. And when you factor in Japan, Japan can be a great help with that. There was something that we should have ratified in the US called the Trade Promotion Partnership, TPP. And when Trump walked away from it, Japan seized the leadership. Good play, because using Asian countries as a buffer to China is very smart. And Japan understood that and filled the void. So what would I say about the whole relationship? It's confused. It's chaotic under this management, our management. And I think Japan is probably a little anxious. I'd be interested in what the others say about this upcoming Xi-Trump meeting and where it will lead.
Right. Bob, if I may skip to you, China relations.
I think this is where it's critical to look outside of the two powers and to think really about the rest of the world. And again, Jane, I think, alluded to this before, following the Cold War, this idea that we have won and, they have lost now has been replaced by this, the great tension in the world is between the US and China. I can say, talking to business leaders around the world, they ask, why are we being forced to choose? Right? And it's not natural to choose. You see huge growth across the global south. Take a country like India. Does India have to choose just to work with the US when China is investing also so much in developing and they already have deep trade relations with China? So, I think this is quite dangerous actually, where, the answer to this for the rest of the world may not be the answer that many in this administration think will be the answer. Like, you present a choice, obviously the choice is to side with America. I don't think it's true. I mean, it's fascinating to travel through Southeast Asia. And I think this is where also Japanese organizations really have deep relations all across APAC and the rest of the world, and how to deal with both working together with China, maybe that's growing, there's caution, but also thinking about it in a broader context. I think that's what I see in business leaders around the world, and particularly across the Middle East, the global south, and now increasingly you see the same in Europe as well, given, I think, the threats with this long-standing relationship.
Right. Glenn.
So I agree with what Jane mentioned about the three-dimensional game of chess that's required. But on Bob's point, I have actually a report that just came out from the ISEAS in Southeast Asia think tank. April 7th, this annual report was released. And the question is, if ASEAN were forced, this is Southeast Asian countries, were forced to align itself with one of the strategic rivals, which should it choose? 2025, the US was 52.3% and China was 47.7%. 2026, China is 52% The U.S. is 48%. So clearly, over a one-year period, there's been a decline, I think, in large part because of the tariffs and the uncertainty. The other question that I think is interesting is when they were asked, the ASEAN countries were asked, who will be reliable as a leader in championing global free trade. In 2025, it was the US is 19%, China at 20.6%. 2026, China goes up to 21.3%, and the US goes down to 14.8%. So on both indicators, at least from the Southeast Asian perspective, I think the US is losing ground to China. And so I think that the US needs to have a very strategic, long-term policy to deal with China, number one, but also to work effectively with allies and partners, including Japan and European countries, Southeast Asia, Australia, India, and others. And then thirdly, within the US needs to have a focus on developing and protecting those industries that are of strategic value, and in particular in the military area. So I think the current administration is just too focused on the transactional. I think when Trump goes to China, people are expecting he's going to get more soybean exports, he's going to get maybe some Boeing aircraft in, but it's not going to be a long-term strategic approach that's necessary in dealing with China.
So it's very interesting, when I go around meeting with Japanese policymakers and CEOs, their biggest nightmare is that in May, the Emperor of America is going to cut a deal with China. And specifically that deal is going to be allowing BYD, the Chinese car company, and some of the other Chinese car companies to actually build factories and sell their cars in the United States of America. It's empirical. The CEO of Ford Motors has visited the Oval Office 3 times over the last couple of months. And supposedly the base idea is that they will be offered, the Chinese car companies will be offered the same contracts, the same terms that Volkswagen was offered when they started their joint ventures and car production in the People's Republic of China in the 1980s, which basically means that after 8 to 10 years, all the intellectual property, everything is owned by the Chinese company and not by the parent company anymore. Now, whether that's a strategic thing or not, we shall see, but as Glenn pointed out, I think this summit between China and the United States of America, in the next couple of months is going to be absolutely key. By the way, it's very interesting, Takaichi's 17 growth sectors that you're going to focus on, quantum computing, blah, blah, blah. First time in the economic history of post-war Japan, one sector is missing: cars. Cars and mobility are not part, for the first time in post-war history, of the of the government economic growth strategy. Now, having said that, you are the growth strategy of Japan. Any questions that you have to the audience? And remember, it's German rules that apply, which means that if you don't ask a question within 30 seconds, you have to give a bottle of champagne to all of the panelists here. Please, any questions, any comments? Yes, sir.
Question for Bob. I wonder if this extended closure of Hormuz will affect Japanese supply chain, especially for AI industry. Thank you.
Oh, I think absolutely it will affect Japan and the rest of the world, particularly all across Asia. I mean, it's, how much of kind of trade and certainly petrochemicals that come through the Strait, I think disproportionately is affecting Asia, and I think Japan as a result. The tie with AI, I'm not sure if I understand, kind of the linkage there. I think semiconductors. Yeah, I don't see that as much. I mean, I think it'll take a while to play out, but I mean, you do see the dependency still that the world has on oil in so many downstream industries. So indirectly, I mean, the work that we've done, by the way, really suggests not only the immediate disruption, but that this disruption, even if things are resolved quickly, will create tremendous instability for many, many months to come. So, I guess in that sense it would, but I don't think it's really the first order effect that we've seen.
I just want to add that Kanda Masato, the head of the Asian Development Bank, has recently been writing about the impact of the shortage of energy for Asia and the really devastating impact that he sees in playing. And so I think a lot depends on how long this is going to last, but clearly there's going to be very negative. Clearly, it's going to be a very negative impact, right? So I think the sooner it stops, the sooner the conflict ends, the better.
So it's actually, sorry, on the Strait of Hormuz, it's actually quite interesting. The hit to Japan is not from higher energy prices. I mean, Japan has a lot of reserves. These reserves are being mobilized. The gas price for consumers basically has been fixed, right? And of course, if this lasts for a long time, the energy cost push will start to have an impact, right? But that's not the real threat. The real threat is the hit on Asia Pacific. And as a result of that, the hit that is going to come to Japanese corporate profits as Southeast Asia, as the global South, goes into a deep recession. That's the real risk. For every 1% that global economic growth declines, Japanese corporate profits drop by about 35%. Right? That's the gearing that you have. So it's the world economy at risk, particularly Asia Pacific, rather than the hit to the purchasing power of the Japanese people, which METI and the government, I mean, they know how to do this. This is being managed very, very well. Any additional questions that you have? Sir.
So this is for Jane. In this transactional world, do you see a role for Japan in developing a more long-term defense strategy that might help the fracturing between America and the Allies?
I love that question. Absolutely, yes. It seems to me, in a more fractured world where the threats are from lone actors, radicalized little groups, terror groups, and all kinds of other folk who didn't have this power some time ago, that the whole world has to join together to fight this. And just look at little Ukraine under unfair attack by the big bear, Russia, next door, which has figured out how to build from zero a defense industry and defend itself for 4 years because the rest of the world hasn't provided enough help. I'm not saying Japan provides no help. Japan does. But the U.S. portion of help is declining to the, embarrassing low level that it now is. And Ukraine is alive and exporting to the world. So I think this is a good model. And I really hope that Japan, for one, makes a modern defense one of its core industries, and with the rest of the freedom-loving world, builds a resilience against bad guys that doesn't exist now.
Robert, just for 30 seconds, it's very interesting. The U.S. may be bypassed by its own internal problems, and you see that one of the first reactions from Japan was to develop a fighter together with Britain and Italy, and now Canada wants to be part of that whole thing. Mm-hmm. So this whole Carney from Canada's idea of the middle powers starting to get their act together, bypassing the United States of America, is certainly something that the more confused and chaotic Washington stays, the more organized the rest of the world is going to be. And watch very carefully the Japan-Korea relationship on defense going forward. I think that's going to be the key litmus test.
Could I just add one thing to that? I think it's a tragedy for the U.S. that this is happening. I'm not blaming other countries for doing this, but we're our own worst enemy. And as we retreat from helping parts of the world, especially the third world, China moves right in. The Belt and Road Initiative is more potent than ever before. And that's not even talking about the Defense Alliance. We have circled the wagons, as they say, and we're firing in.
Any additional questions? I'm going to take 2 questions. Sir.
Yeah, I'd ask, could you talk a little bit about de-dollarization and its role in the fractured world and how that plays into all these themes of defense that you've been talking about?
De-dollarization, excellent. And you?
My question is, in Mr. like Ray Dalio, I think that we are early phase of, the World War III, and I would like to, hear the Jane's view about that, and how can we prevent that, and the roles of Japan and the U.S. there.
Great. Okay, World War III. Jane, you're first. I want your quick lightning comment on World War III as well, and then we talk about de-dollarization. Jane.
Well, not so fast. I don't think we're at World War III yet. But somebody could be careless and use a nuclear weapon. And where that goes, I don't know. And that's why I've been talking about the need for a new non-proliferation regime and a strategy behind our foreign and defense policy. But I don't think that happens tomorrow.
Right. Glenn, quick comment.
Well, on de-dollarization, I think, there's a lot of debate.
Yep.
Okay. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which the dollar is going to continue as the world's reserve currency. I tend to be on the more optimistic side because I think that when this administration ends, we will go back to a more sane policy economically, including trade. And so I think that the decline of the role of the dollar right now is going to be a temporary issue, and I'm expecting that the U.S. will be able to resume its role, but I may be too optimistic.
Right, Bob?
Yeah, I'd probably would comment more on the World War III question, than the dollar. I think I don't see it. I see a much longer kind of period of, a fractured world, where this world order, particularly globalization and trading relationships, still exist. Even though the U.S. has really dented that in recent times, the world is still more connected than ever through trade and commerce with the rising prosperity over time of the global South. So I think with all that in mind, there'll continue to be hot spots within geopolitics and outright conflict and even war, yet that becoming something much bigger, I have a hard time seeing that.
So it's very interesting on de-dollarization, right? It's everywhere but in the numbers, right? There's a lot of talk about this, but the reality is that, yes, the People's Republic of China has reduced its treasury holdings and has swapped them for gold holdings, right? But in general, what you see is that the dominance of the dollar as a reserve currency and as a settlement currency has actually increased over the last couple of years rather than declined. What is true, however, is that in this whole spirit of fragmentation, and I can no longer trust the America as providing global public goods. America dominates, when you're a Machiavellian, America dominates three key platforms of our life, which is everything digital is dominated by the US oligopolies, right? Anything payments is dominated by the United States of America, and anything war is dominated by the United States of America. So other nations, led by the People's Republic of China, but you will see Japan, for example, making strides into that as well, developing alternative payment system is starting to come through. Now, the reality is about de-dollarization. If you have to stand in front of the Asset Allocation Committee of Nippon Life, of the GPIF, right? There is no alternative asset. If you are Nippon Life, you have to have the ability to liquidate, for example, if there's an earthquake in Japan, right? I need to have liquidity in yen to pay for these claims that are going to start to come through. I need to be able to liquidate $50 billion, or even $10 billion, or even $8 billion, right? Without impacting the price. There is only one market in the world that you can do that, which is the US Treasury market. I cannot hold Chinese bonds and liquidate them without impacting the price. Even you and I will impact the price on a Chinese bond. So from that perspective, yes, it's true that global nations are trying to build alternatives to digital, to payments, to war, right? But for the right now and here, for the foreseeable future, the US dominance, because of the liquidity and depth that the US capital markets provide, is going to continue to stay in place. Any other questions or comments? Hori-san, you're going to ask a question to Jane.
Maybe asking a question to Jane. But what is the exit strategy of the war in Iran, and what's going to have the impact? What is the scenario? Because that has a major impact into the economy and a major impact into the geopolitics.
Okay, Jane, we're all waiting.
Well, Yoshi, you may still be alive, but I won't when this turmoil in the Middle East ends. More seriously, we didn't have a good strategy to enter the war. Richard Haas, who many know, called this a war of choice, and it's true. Declaring victory after the shorter war of, I guess, 8 months ago would have been the smarter play, but we entered this war thinking it would be very short, and it isn't. And I think there's a risk it ends up where it started, and that Japan has a degraded missile capacity and certainly degraded infrastructure and sadly destruction of desalination plants and hurts to its population. But I don't know that that there's what could be called regime change. Yes, there's been decapitation at the top. The elders are dead, but the juniors are just as hard line. So that's not going to work. In terms of removing its intent to make nuclear weapons, I think its intent to make nuclear weapons is strengthened. Removing enriched uranium, maybe, but it's not going to be done by U.S. soldiers going down in deep tunnels. It will be done by international organizations. Somehow, the IAEA and others putting some constraints on the canisters, et cetera. Looking at the Strait of Hormuz, I hope that strait will be open now, because there's huge damage to the whole world, including the U.S., even though we are self-reliant on fossil fuels. There's one big energy economy, and we're getting hurt. So, maybe there'll be a ceasefire. There is sort of one right now, but as Trump would say, Iran has a lot of cards. It just takes a little speedboat to scare the insurance companies to tell ships they can't go through the strait. So I don't know the answer, Yoshi. I would say where I started, a branch of our government that used to play a huge role in planning, structuring, financing, and monitoring our engagements in the world in the direction of hostilities was the United States Congress. And all they're doing is throwing grenades at each other. And that is just a tragedy. And I think the U.S. government's a lot weaker because of it. And I think Trump could care less what Congress says. And final comment, I think this is true, and you're all more business oriented than I, but I think Trump is negotiating with the markets. He's not negotiating with the Iranians or the Americans or the Congress or the Japanese. But how the markets go is going to be the biggest influence on him. And my impression is, as of today, maybe the other panelists and maybe you, Yoshi, would have better sense. The markets are not as bad as some were predicting. And I don't understand that, but maybe that will change as this goes on.
It's interesting. Unfortunately, time is up. Jane makes an important point. Who controls Trump? And the idea was always, yes, it is the market. The market is very close to an all-time high back again. The question is going to be whether in 2026, in the November midterm elections, whether indeed this is the American people that are Trump's boss rather than just the markets. But I'll leave that for another point in time. Japan-US relationship in this fractured world, I think the takeaways are very simple and very straightforward. Japan is ambitious. Japan is a bastion of stability with a leadership that is very level-headed and pragmatic, very closely related to building and fostering a greater alliance, a more dense alliance with the United States of America, while at the same time ensuring that the channels of self-sufficiency in Japan and resilience actually are being increased. And then last but not least, I think it's fair to say that Japan is actually very confident in the sense of that they're not afraid of actually taking on the United States of America. Jane, you mentioned that unfortunate Pearl Harbor slip that Mr. Trump made. Do you know what the first words were when Takaichi greeted Trump?
No.
Donald, or whatever, however, I don't know how she addresses him. But Mr. President, it's so good to see you again. I wanted to bring you some presents. I brought 250 new sakura cherry trees, but I can't deliver them to you personally because your American quarantine system is so archaic they couldn't be delivered on time. This is a woman who knows what she's doing. Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference.